second presentation of this panel, and this will be by Krzysztof Piętak, who I believe is a student in the doctoral school of humanities at the University of Warsaw. So please welcome him to the stage.
Hello everyone. I would like to say today a few things about qualia, physicalism, and George Berkeley. And I will begin with some definitions. In the second part, I will try to convince you that in contemporary philosophy of mind, this problem is largely determined by the debate between eliminativism and property dualism. In the third part, I will try to show you why, if so, we can demonstrate that physicalism is incompatible with empiricism. And in the third part, I will make an attempt to show that the argument I will sketch here mirror in almost every detail Berkeley's criticism of materialism. So even if the argument that I will present here is misguided, it has at least a value in the domain of history of philosophy, since it can help us to better understand Berkeley's metaphysics and epistemology. And indeed, if I am right, it is only now that we are in a position to assess correctly the argumentative power of his philosophy. So now I turn to the first part. According to the standard interpretation, the existence of qualia is something at least prima facie obvious. And although I agree with this contention, I will try to complicate a bit this picture. So usually philosophers who want to introduce this notion give examples of qualia instead of defining what they are. And the most paradigmatic examples of qualia are pain and redness. But this list can be extended very easily. It at least include all the so-called secondary qualities, so smells, flavors, colors, and bodily sensations like pain, thirst, and hunger. And what all these different things have in common is that you have to experience them from a third-person point of view in order to know what they are in their essence, or at least know something that you cannot know without experiencing them. But things are not so easy, because if we want, with the dualist, to leverage the existence of qualia as a premise in an argument against physicalism and not merely affirm their existence, we are committed to ascribe one controversial property to qualia. And we can call it the ontological property. It is emphasized by Saul Kripke in Naming and Necessity, where he assumes, without providing any argument for this contention, that in the case of qualia, it is impossible to make the distinction between essence and appearance, because their essence is that they appear. So to put it roughly, pain is the sensation or the qualia of pain. Nothing more, nothing less. And if it is true, both the existence of a painless pain and of an illusion of pain is metaphysically impossible. The first is impossible because it would be the case of an essence of pain without an appearance of pain, and the second is impossible because it would be the case of an appearance of pain without an essence of pain. And although I am pretty sure that for many non-philosophers this property is not controversial, it is a historical fact that many philosophers are very reluctant to accept that is an essential property of qualia. And to give a suggestive example, it is commonly accepted among scholars of Greek philosophy, a historian of Greek philosophy, that for Plato the idea of red is not itself red. Now, the denial of the ontological property implies that it is not necessarily true that qualia are accessible from a first point of view, since if we can distinguish between essence and appearance in the case of qualia, maybe it is possible to get an epistemic access to them without experience, or from a third-person point of view. So to summarize this point, what is not controversial is that such things as pain and redness seems to exist. What is controversial is that it is impossible to distinguish between essence and appearance in the case of those entities, and the success of the argument that I will present requires the acceptance of this controversial property. Now I turn to the definition of physicalism. Bertrand Russell, in his preface to Lang's monumental book entitled The History of Materialism, writes, "Materialism as a theory of the nature of the world has had a curious history. Arising almost at the beginning of Greek philosophy, it has persisted down to our own time, in spite of the fact that very few eminent philosophers have advocated it. It has been associated with many scientific advances and has seemed in certain epochs almost synonymous with a scientific outlook." And in this passage, Russell seems to suggest that materialism is synonymous with scientism and amount to the methodological thesis that, according to which the best methods we have for finding out about the world are the methods that we find in natural sciences. But materialism is also often understood as an ontological thesis, opposed, for instance, to dualism or idealism. And according to this thesis, everything in the world is physical and there is nothing beyond the physical stuff. But it is difficult to interpret this slogan in a precise way. What is this condition being physical that, according to physicalism, everything has or is? And one way of answering this question is to say that physical facts are facts susceptible to scientific investigation. If so, the ontological thesis and the methodological thesis overlap. But some would argue that it is inadmissible to define physicalism in that way, because it seems to imply that if physicalism is true, we could at least potentially know everything about the world. So formulate the so-called theory of everything. And many physicalists think that it does not make sense because we cannot preclude a priori that some physical facts lie beyond the scope of human understanding. And to be sure, it could be so that the theory of everything is possible to formulate, but this issue must be settled by an empirical investigation and not by an arbitrary definition of physicalism. Now, it is sure that this objection is well grounded, but if we accept it, we are left without answer to our initial questions, what physicalism means. And the truth is that to these days, those who don't accept the identification of physicalism with scientism haven't managed to provide any adequate definition of this term. Galen Strawson, for instance, in his recent book, who wishes to define physicalism by its ontological component, say what follows. We must be radically ignorant about fundamental aspects of the nature of the physical if materialism is true, and argue that the espousal of materialism is partly a matter of fate. So I think that in the light of what I said, it is not at least extremely controversial to define physicalism as the contention that de jure everything in the world is susceptible to an investigation from a third-person point of view. And anyway, the success of my argument requires the acceptance of this definition. Now I turn to the second part, in which I will try to show that the issue of the compatibility of physicalism with the thesis that qualia exist is largely determined by the controversy between eliminativism and property dualism. And the main premise of my argument is that indeed the controversy in question really has taken place in contemporary philosophy of mind. And what I mean by this is that it was neither a discussion about a pseudo-problem nor a debate about something foggy, but a substantial controversy concerning serious issues. Something really important has emerged during this controversy. And if it is true, it means that both sides of this controversy has been affected by it. And in order to show that it is the case, I will reconstruct the course of this controversy as follows. So, in the 50s of the 20th century, Smart and other reductive physicalists identified a genuine problem. How physicalism can be true if qualia exist? And their answer was that physicalism can be true if qualia are reducible to something physical, namely brain states. After this, Kripke and other dualists, Kripke is not a dualist, but mainly Kripke came with his argument against reductive physicalism, and under the pressure of this argument, physicalist has embraced an eliminativist stance according to which qualia do not exist. As Galen Strawson rightly emphasized, contemporary physicalists, passionately committed to the idea that everything is physical, make the most extraordinary move that has ever been made in the history of human thought. They deny the existence of consciousness, they become eliminativists. But it is worth noting that despite its counterintuitiveness, eliminativists have this advantage over traditional physicalists, that they are able to formulate what we can call an internal objection against dualism. And what do I mean by this? Well, according to eliminativism, qualia are not something given, are not an illusion or something like this, even if they are not something given, but they are theoretical entities postulated by a relatively primitive psychological theory, namely folk psychology. And folk psychology is the psychology that is held by the so-called laymen or non-philosophers. And in this respect, they have the same ontological status as phlogiston. And if so, the dualist cannot simply refer to the content of his introspection, like he do in the case of the physicalist, in order to make his point, because this content could be distorted by an inadequate theoretical framework. So he or she has to prove that qualia have a different ontological status, than the one ascribed them by the eliminativist. And if this reconstruction is correct, both sides of the controversy has been affected by it, because on the one hand, dualists forced physicalists to endorse eliminativism, and physicalists for the first time in history formulate an internal objection against the existence of qualia. And in this case, eliminativism is not a temporary aberration, which differs from more standard version of physicalism by its old radicalism. Its main merits consist precisely in articulating the truth present implicitly in the previous version of physicalism, namely that the existence of qualia is incompatible with physicalism. And now I turn to the third part of my presentation. So, how I define empiricism. And in order to make my approach plausible, some historical considerations are required. So along with what I called after some manual to epistemology, with the Popperian revolution in the philosophy of science, a new attempt had been elaborated in order to guarantee our scientific theories and empirical connection with the external world. And Popper justifies the need of such refinements by pointing out that the derivation of all the implications of, firstly, the thesis that all observations are theoretically charged, and secondly, the criticism against induction made by Hume refutes the traditional empirical approach. So it is necessary to show in what sense our scientific theories are related to the external world. And I'm sure you know, but I have to say it. According to Popper, a theory is scientific, not if it is an inductive generalization from empirical experience, but if it can be falsified in confrontation with empirical experience. And this approach permits Popper to guarantee our knowledge a connection with the external world. However, it totally gives up almost all the ambitions of traditional empiricism. Especially, it excludes the possibility of determining whether our theories are true. And this claim is a part of a position called fallibilism. The central thesis of fallibilism is that all assertions are provisional and thus open to revision in light of new evidence. And Popper used fallibilism as a way to defend what we can call a naive realism. He says that, or the mere belief in the existence of an external world, in the sense that if we are not fallibilists, according to him, we can defend the idealist attempt to reduce the world to what we know about the world. And in this sense, it is incompatible that we can know that we have a complete knowledge about the world. And my proposition, it's not only my proposition, but it's defended by many epistemologists who are fallibilists. Fallibilism is what remained from the traditional empiricism after the Popperian revolution in philosophy of science. And with this definition, I can argue that physicalism is incompatible with empiricism by evaluating the implications of this position in the context of the famous Jackson's argument from knowledge. And this argument can be formulated as follows. The first premise is that X knows everything about the physical world. The second premise is that it is not the case that X knows everything about the world. And the first conclusion is that, therefore, physicalism is incomplete. Now, the second part of the argument, if physicalism is incomplete, physicalism is false. And now from 3 and 4, the main conclusion, physicalism is false. And in order to make plausible the second premise, so that it is not the case that X knows everything about the world, Jackson formulated the following thought experiment. It's about Mary, who is confined in a black and white room, and she learns everything there is to know about the physical nature of the world. But in this black and white room, she knows all the physical facts about us and our environment in a wide sense of physical, which includes everything in completed physics, chemistry, and neurophysiology, and all there is to know about the causal and relational facts consequent upon all this, including, of course, functional roles. And Jackson said that if physicalism is true, she knows all there is to know. For to suppose otherwise is to suppose that there is more to know than every physical fact, and that it is just what physicalism denies. But it seems, however, that Mary does not know all there is to know, for when she is let out of her black and white room, she will learn what it is like to see something red. And now I turn to my reasoning. So, in the most relevant discussions about the knowledge argument, which involve such names as Churchland, Dennett, Levine, Jackson, and others, and Chalmers, the dispute concerns the second premise. On the one hand, the history of Mary has as its purpose to stimulate the intuition that physical knowledge is not all the knowledge about the world. And on the other hand, physicalists attempt to show that the history of Mary hasn't any serious philosophical implications. However, for me, it is the first premise that is problematic. Because if fallibilism is true, Mary cannot, first of all, rationally be certain that she possesses all the physical knowledge about the world. And moreover, if she thought so, she will have no reason to leave her room in order to make attempts to falsify theories that she learned when she was locked in her black and white room. So we can formulate this argument as follows. Empiricism defined as fallibilism implies the thesis that qualia exist. Physicalism rejects the thesis that qualia exist. Therefore, physicalism rejects empiricism. And I could say a lot about it, but I will leave it now like it is to hear some commentaries maybe. And now I turn to the third part of my presentation. Margaret Wilson, in one of her most beautiful essays about Berkeley, notes, of all the major modern philosophical systems, the views of George Berkeley have probably met with the most resistance, ridicule, and distortion. And indeed, during his life, his philosophy was mostly caricatured by his opponents. In the 19th and 20th century, in turns, even if certain elements of his philosophy had found either admirers as John Stuart Mill or serious critics as Alfred Ayer, almost nobody examined seriously the totality of his system. And even contemporary scholars at best attempt to defend Berkeley from the accusation that he is a subjective idealist or a solipsist, but they never try to substantiate his positive contention, namely that he is the only authentic realist and that his opponents are much closer to solipsism than they think. And why I claim that Berkeley adopts this positive contention. So to show this, I will quote one of the most neglected passages from his three dialogues between Hillas and Philonous. And the context. After showing that materialists who introduce the difference between appearance and reality in the case of impressions or sensual ideas are committed to the claim that the essence of the real world is unknowable, he adds with furor, how should we treat those philosophers who want to deprive this noble and delightful sense of all reality? How should we think of principles implying that all the visible beauty of the creation is a false imaginary glare? So it is clear from this passage and others that I don't have time to quote here, that Berkeley presents himself as the defender of the reality created by God against those who replace God's creation with their own speculations filled with invisible entities like matter and atoms. And how Berkeley substantiates this criticism. So, according to contemporary Berkeley scholar, the formula esse percipi aimed to answer two basic metaphysical questions. What does it mean to exist, and what really exists? And to the first question, Berkeley answer is esse is percipi. To the second question, Berkeley answer is what exists are ideas, or sensual impressions to which we have direct cognitive access in empirical experience. And the existence of these ideas is reducible to the fact that they are perceived. Moreover, they are epistemically transparent, which means that they don't have any hidden properties. And it is easy to see that this description of ideas corresponds to our definition of qualia. Therefore, the world of Berkeley is made of qualia, the created world. Now I think that we are in a position to understand why Berkeley thought that only his system is able to vindicate the fate of the layman in the existence of the external world. If being perceivable wouldn't be the essential property of existent things, Mary could spend all her life in the black and white room and be convinced that the best way to get knowledge about the world is to read books and scientific manuals which describe the world. Nobody could convince her that it is maybe not the silliest idea in the world to leave the black and white room and confront what she learns there with the real world. Therefore, in order to convince Mary to leave her room, we have to try to convince her that esse est percipi, or at least percipi is esse, two contentions that Berkeley defends separately for the same reason. And if I am right, Berkeley was indeed what we can call a great philosopher, because he understood what took us more than 4 centuries to understand, not without careful elaboration, namely that materialism is incompatible with empiricism, and that materialism leads to the same practical consequences than solipsism. Indeed, why the solipsist should leave the room in which he is locked? After all, the world is what he imagines to be the world. Thank you very much.